Romans chapter 1 verse 13. Now I would not have you ignorant, brethren, that oftentimes I purposed to come unto you, but was led hitherto, that I might have some fruit among you also, even as among other Gentiles. Verse 14. I am debtor both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and the unwise. Verse 15. So as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. Now I would not have you ignorant. He now confirms the testimony he had given of his constant supplication to God to allow him on some occasion to visit them, since it might have appeared a vain profession if he had neglected to embrace the opportunities which presented themselves. For he says, the power was wanting, not the endeavor, having frequently been prevented from his intended purpose of visiting the churches at Rome. We hence learn that the Lord frequently overthrows the plans of his saints with a view to humble them, and by such a state of humiliation to keep their minds constantly exercised in looking to his providence, on which they are thus taught to depend, although their plans in a proper sense are not frustrated, because they enter into no deliberations without the will of God. For it is the daring attempt of impiety to determine on future plans without consulting God, as if they could be regulated by our power, which conduct St. James in chapter 4 verse 13 severely reproves. Paul means when he says he had been hitherto hindered, that the Lord imposed upon him the transaction of more urgent business, which he could not omit without injury to the church. The impediments of believers and unbelievers differ, for the latter feel themselves hindered when they are unable to move from the violent hand of the Lord, and the former are satisfied to be prevented by some lawful reason, and allow themselves to attempt nothing either besides their duty or contrary to edification, that I might have some fruit. He speaks of the fruit which the apostles were sent by the Lord to collect. I have chosen you, that you may go and bring forth fruit, and your fruit may remain. John 15, verse 10. He calls the fruit his own, which he collected for the Lord, not himself, because nothing is more the property of the pious than any event which promotes the glory of God, with which all their happiness is united. He states also that this had befallen him among other nations, for the purpose of inspiring the Romans with a hope of his arrival, not being useless, which had been attended with advantage among so many of the Gentiles. To the Greeks and barbarians, the wise, etc. The epithets wise and unwise explain the meaning of Greek and barbarian. And I retain the words of the apostle without blaming Erasmus, who translates them learned and ignorant. Paul draws an argument, therefore, from his office to show that he must not be blamed for arrogance, because he hoped to be of some use in teaching the Romans. However much they excelled, both in learning and prudence and skill, since God had determined to make him debtor also to the wise. Two things are here to be considered. First, that a heavenly command has destined and offered the gospel to the wise, by which the Lord may subject all the wisdom and all the ingenuity of the world to himself, and make every kind of science and the sublimity of all the arts yield to the simplicity of his doctrine, especially because the learned are reduced into discipline with the ignorant, and become so tame as to endure those characters to be schoolfellows under Christ their Master, whom they would not before have deigned to receive as scholars. In the second place, the ignorant ought not by any means to be debarred from this school, or the learned to avoid it with a vain fear. For if Paul was a debtor to the poor, and is to be considered in debt to the very best faith, he truly paid what he owed. They will therefore, in this instance, find what they shall be capable of enjoying. All teachers have here a rule to follow, namely, to order themselves, in a modest and kind manner, to the ignorant and illiterate. By such a plan they will quietly endure much absurd conduct, and patiently bear with innumerable instances of pride, by which they might, without such a lesson, have been overcome. It is, however, their duty to remember that they are laid under such obligations to the foolish, as not by immoderate indulgence to cherish their folly. So, as much as in me is. He concludes what he had hitherto said of his own desire to go to Rome. And since it seemed to be a part of his duty to spread the gospel among them, with a view to collect fruit to the Lord, he manifests his earnest wish to satisfy the call of God, as far as he was permitted by the Lord. Verse 16, For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to every one that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, The just shall live by faith. I am not ashamed. He here prevents and answers an objection by stating that he pays no regard to the scorn of the wicked, and in passing he embraces this opportunity for commending the dignity of the gospel, that it might not be despised by the Romans. He hints, indeed, that the gospel is despised by the world, when he says he is not ashamed of it himself, and he thus prepares the Romans to bear the dishonor of the cross of Christ, that they might not undervalue the gospel, which they saw exposed to the scoffs and taunts of the wicked, while he proves against its opponents how highly it was valued by believers. The power of God, in the first place, if it deserves to be magnified, shines forth in the gospel. If goodness is worthy of being desired and loved, the gospel is the instrument of that goodness, and it ought to be deservedly honored and esteemed, since veneration is due to the power of God. And we ought to love it in proportion as our salvation is thus secured. Observe also how much Paul attributes to the ministry of the word, when he testifies that God in the gospel exerts his power for saving us by its means, for he is not speaking here of any secret revelation, but preaching by the voice. Hence it follows that the power of God is designedly rejected, and his liberating hand removed at a great distance by those who withdraw themselves from hearing the word preached. But because he does not work with efficacy in all, but only where the Spirit shines in our hearts as an internal teacher, he therefore subjoins the sentence, to every one that believeth. The gospel is, indeed, offered to all for salvation, but its power does not everywhere appear, and that it is the savor of death to unbelievers arises not so much from the nature of the gospel as from their own wickedness. By showing one way of salvation, it cuts off all other confidence, and by withdrawing themselves from this only salvation, the gospel gives them a certain proof of their own ruin. When therefore the gospel invites all indifferently to salvation, it is properly termed the doctrine of salvation. For Christ is there offered, and his proper office is to save that which had perished, and such as refuse to be saved by him experience him in the character of their judge. The word salvation is everywhere in Scripture opposed simply to death, and when it occurs, we must consider the subject treated of, for when the gospel frees from the ruin and curse of eternal death, the salvation secured by it is everlasting life. To the Jew first and Greek. Under the name Greek, he here comprehends all Gentiles, as the comparison proves, since he was desirous to include all mankind under these two classes. It is probable Paul had chiefly chosen the Greek nation, from whom he denominated all Gentiles, because they were the first after the Jews who were made partakers of the gospel covenant, and the Jews were better acquainted with the Greeks on account of their vicinity and the great celebrity of their language. The whole, therefore, of the Gentiles is meant by one part of these, the Greeks, and he thus in general unites Jews and Gentiles in the participation of the gospel, without depriving the Jews of their degree and rank, since they were the first in promise and calling. The apostle, therefore, secures their prerogative for the Jews, but immediately joins the Gentiles, although as partakers of the same blessing in an inferior degree. For the righteousness of God unto salvation. This is an explanation and confirmation of the former sentence, that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. For if we seek salvation, or life with God, we must first seek righteousness, by which being reconciled to him, we may obtain, by his being propitious to us, that life which consists in his benevolence alone. For we must first be necessarily righteous, that we may be loved of God, for he hates unrighteousness. The meaning, therefore, is that we can obtain salvation by no other method than the gospel, since God has nowhere else revealed his righteousness to us, which alone frees us from death. And this righteousness, the foundation of salvation, is revealed in the gospel, whence the gospel is called the power of God unto salvation. In this way we reason from cause to effect. Again, observe how rare and precious a treasure God confers upon us in his gospel, namely, the communication of his righteousness. I understand that to be the righteousness of God, which is approved at his tribunal, as on the other hand that is generally called the righteousness of man, which, in the opinion of our fellow beings, is reckoned and esteemed righteousness, though it be only smoke. Yet I doubt not but Paul alludes to many prophecies where the Spirit everywhere celebrates the righteousness of God in the future kingdom of Christ. Some explain it to mean what is given us of God. And I, indeed, acknowledge the words, admit this sense, because God justifies us by his gospel, therefore he saves us. The former sense appears to me more suitable to the context, though I do not much dispute concerning this subject. It is of more importance that some consider this righteousness to consist not only in the gratuitous remission of sins, but partly also in the grace of regeneration. But I think we are therefore restored to life because God reconciles us to himself gratuitously, as we will afterwards treat more fully in its proper place. Moreover, he now uses the expression by faith, who before said to every believer, for righteousness is offered by the gospel and perceived by faith. He subjoins to faith because, in proportion to the advancement of our faith and to our progress in this knowledge, the righteousness of God increases in us, and its possession is, in some measure, confirmed and ratified. When we first taste the gospel, we behold, indeed, the countenance of God joyful and stretched forth toward us. But at a distance, the more our knowledge of piety increases, we behold the grace of God, as if he was making nearer approaches to us with greater clearness, and in a more familiar manner. The opinion of those who think the Old and New Testament to be here secretly compared is more acute than solid. For Paul does not in this passage compare the fathers who lived under the law with us, but he marks the daily progress of each believer. As it is written, he proves the righteousness of faith by the authority of the prophet Habakkuk. For when he prophesies concerning the destruction of the proud, he at the same time adds, the life of the righteous consists in faith. But we do not live in the presence of God except by righteousness, whence it follows that our righteousness is also placed in faith. The future verb points out the solid perpetuity of the life mentioned by him, as if he had said, it shall not continue for a moment, but endure forever. For the wicked also are puffed up with a false opinion of life. But when they say peace and security, then sudden destruction cometh upon them. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 3. Theirs is a shadow which endures only for a moment, while the faith of the righteous alone brings everlasting life. Whence does this arise, but from faith leading us to God, and placing our life in him? For Paul would not have quoted this passage in an appropriate manner unless the prophet meant that we then stand fast when we rest on God by faith. And he has not indeed ascribed the life of the pious to faith, unless so far as they gather themselves together under the protection of their own God, while they condemn the pride of the world. The prophet does not, indeed, professedly treat of this subject, and hence he makes no mention of gratuitous righteousness. But it is sufficiently evident from the nature of faith that this passage suits the present subject. From this method of reasoning, we also necessarily infer the mutual relation of faith and the gospel. For because the just is said to be about to live by faith, it follows that such a life is perceived by the gospel. We have now the principal point or hinge of the first part of this epistle, that we are justified by faith through the alone mercy of God. We have not this expressly stated in as many words by Paul, but it evidently appears afterwards from the context that the righteousness which is founded on faith wholly depends on the mercy of God.